for the day is Dr. Spivak from the University of Minnesota. She is a MacArthur Fellow, which is quite a big deal. And she's also a McKnight Distinguished Professor in Entomology at the University of Minnesota. And her research efforts have focused on protecting the health of all bees, breeding bees for their natural defenses against diseases and parasites. If you remember the Minnesota hygienic bee, it's because of this lady that we had those. Promoting sustainable beekeeping practices, propagating floral-rich and pesticide-free landscapes to support the nutrition, health, and diversity of bee pollinators. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Spivak.
Thank you for having me. I guess it's no secret that this is where I started beekeeping, south of Albuquerque. It was many moons ago. And I was going to school in Arizona. I'm from Denver, and I was going to school in Prescott, Arizona, at Prescott College, which many of you might know is kind of an experiential and experimental college. And they had us design our own curriculums, and I had no idea what to do. So I went to the library and got a book to read, because I didn't know what else to do. And I picked something up on bees, and I stayed up all night. I read this thing, and the morning when I woke up, I said, okay, I know what I want to do. Here's my curriculum. I want to go work for a beekeeper. And they said, okay. And I don't know how, but my advisor at Prescott College found Jerry Cole, who lived in Bosque Farms, the Cole family. And I worked for them for a while. For a semester, I got credit for it, then I went back in the summer. And I will tell you that when I went to Jerry's place, Jerry and Janie, or Betty Cole, and their 5 kids, and I lived in their house, and they had a big organic farm, or garden that I was pretty interested in also. When I first got there, the first thing Jerry told me was, we got to move a load of bees to a different site, get in the truck. And it was a nighttime move. It was my very first experience with bees. We moved a load of bees. And, you know, have you moved a load of bees at night? It wasn't a good experience, and I got lots of stings, lots of crawling bees, but somehow I stayed put, and here I am. It was a great experience. That was a great operation, because they were unusual. I didn't know it at the time, but they, you know, had 2,000 colonies of bees. Most of them were stationary hives right along the Rio Grande. Some of them were up almost as far as Taos. But they retailed all their honey. You know, they bottled and retailed all their honey, which now is becoming more and more people are starting to do. But back then, not a lot of beekeepers were doing that. Most beekeepers were selling to big co-ops, I think. So, anyway, so this talk that I'm going to give kind of follows on the heels of what you were just talking about. I'm sorry, it's right here, Loretta. Thank you, that was great. And tomorrow's talk will be about the research that we're doing. So I just want to go through some of the things that are happening in Minnesota right now. Many things started to happen when, at the University of Minnesota, we got a new president. And this guy on the left is Eric Kaler, Dr. Eric Kaler, the new president of the University of Minnesota. And when he became president, he took a tour of some of the labs around campus. And because I had just gotten this MacArthur thing, they decided they better go see the bee lab. And we happened to have a bee tree, a colony in a tree that was taken down, a soft maple. So we had him stick his head in there. And he gingerly kind of did that. But the person that I don't have the photo of right now that really dove in was his wife, Karen. And she has just completely fallen in love with bees. And she's been a huge supporter of everything that's going on, which is great. This was our bee lab, it still is. But finally, after 10 years of pushing the University of Minnesota and pushing and pushing and pushing, I convinced probably our new president, to put forward to our state a capital request to the state of Minnesota to fund a new bee research lab. And they did last year. And so now we're going to be building, I'm working with architects right now, And I'm sorry, we don't have a plan yet. This turned out, I don't know where my color went, but it was in beautiful colors. But this is a kind of a rough layout, not a schematic, as if you're architects, you'll understand. This is not a schematic, this is a conceptual idea of what it might look like. And you can see there's all the O's over here are offices. Let's see, if I push the one in the middle, it's the pointer. Okay. These are offices, lobby, meeting room. But here's garage, hot room, extracting room, lots of unheated storage for Minnesota. We need a lot of unheated storage, a shop, gear room with a shower. Goodness. And 3 labs, one of them a molecular lab, and then 2 practical labs, and one of them will be for a new professor that the state also decided we needed. So I've been also saying that I do honeybees, and I've been covering a lot of the native bee studies because no one else on campus can do this. And so they agreed to fund a new faculty position to study pollinator ecology. So that's somebody to do native bees and habitat. And that person will be in this new lab. So we're breaking ground at the end of this summer, and come visit us. And they're trying, I don't know if you know this, but the U.S. is putting in a bid to host Apimondia in 2019, I believe. And where they want to have it is in Minnesota. Apimondia is an international bee meeting. Doing the bid is kind of like trying to get a bid for the Olympics. It's very, very difficult. But if they do get this meeting, it'll be one of the first in the United States for very, very, very many years. And it will, if they get the bid, it will be in Minnesota, so you can come visit them all. Okay. The other thing that happened simultaneously was that I was also pushing for a public facility where we could show and educate the public about pollinators, all of them, and landscaping for them, pretty much what you were just talking about. This woman, Alice Tashjian, passed away but left a $2 million donation to build this facility. And it will be part of the university, but it's at our landscape arboretum, which is 30 miles west of the Twin Cities. And it will only be for the public. And they will be breaking ground at about the same time. So we've got these 2 parallel buildings, one for research on the University of Minnesota's St. Paul campus, and then this educational facility for the public right near this red barn, and right where we already have a bee yard. And that they're going to develop the area around the red barn to have a whole local food, sustainable ag, and food processing area. So, regarding policy, so interesting because you have a lot of people already doing the pollinator work. Minnesota does not have people doing pollinator work, but they have policy. They began there, which is really unusual. So, I know you don't have to read through all of this, but we have a couple of state representatives that are really pushing for pollinator habitat legislation, like protection legislation. And in 2013, they passed a bill that said the state of Minnesota must protect pollinators by providing habitat necessary, and so our Department of Ag and our Department of Natural Resources needed to come up with best management practices for pollinator protection on farms, in cities, and on roadsides. So these have been developed. There's no money allocated, they're just brochures on how to do pollinator protection, and if you go to the Department of Ag website, Minnesota Department of Ag, there are PDFs you can download. The other thing they did was pass a bill last summer, a pollinator truth in advertising bill for nurseries. Wow. And they said, nurseries cannot advertise plants as pollinator friendly if they have detectable levels of systemic insecticides that can be hazardous to pollinators. So if they're carrying that EPA label that you heard about that says they're a hazard to bees, a nursery cannot advertise those plants as being pollinator friendly if they've already treated them with a systemic. Now, systemic means it's an insecticide that moves through the plant. It comes out, it's translocated, moved to the leaves, and it comes out into the nectar and the pollen of the plant, where it can be very harmful to bees. It can be acutely toxic at a high dose. It can be sublethal at low dose and sublethal. The best explanation I can give you of what a sublethal dose is if you went around and drank 3-2 beer all day long. Okay? So some of you may not get drunk, some of you would kind of get, you'd definitely be running to the bathroom. I mean, it has these other behavioral effects on you and some disorientation, but it doesn't kill you. That's a sublethal effect. Okay. I will say that this pollinator habitat, or the Truth in Advertising Bill for nurseries, our biggest nurseries, Bachman's, Gerton's, even some of our Home Depots, they're on board with this, but they've had a very, very hard time switching over. Some of them are bringing in their plants from other countries, and other countries, in order to get them into the United States, must treat the plants even to get them into the United States, okay? So they can't get away from that. The plants they grow themselves, they can certainly not treat with these systemics, but because they're scale insects on plants, they must use an insecticide of some sort. But so now they're using insecticides that are more harmful to the applicator in the nursery than the systemics are, but they're not on the plant at the time of sale, so you can advertise them as safe for pollinators. The point is that there's trade-offs, big trade-offs. Okay, there's another bill that was passed last summer that I'll go into a little bit. It's the compensation for bees killed by an acute pesticide poisoning. And let me see if I have it. This is how this got started. A lot of backyard beekeepers in the Twin Cities area, and there's backyard beekeepers in very high-end residential areas. And this is a lady who had bees in her backyard, and she went to extract her honey at this other local community place where we had a place to extract honey, and she came back and found her colony dead, big pile of bees in front of the colony. That is an acute pesticide poisoning. That means most of the bees are dead right there. And you can see them in the pile, you can't see them here, but in the pile they were twitching and dying and dead. Did you have a question?
I did, Marla. Is there anything else that causes that particular photo? Okay, if you came to a pile of dead twitching bees, what's an alternate excuse for that?
None. In my knowledge, dead twitching bees in a huge, over 1,000 bees. If it's 500, maybe not. Because you can get some winter starvation and stuff like that. But a big pile of bees, over 1,000 bees, that's an acute pesticide kill. But we came out, we did 2 independent samplings. It always has to be verified with a pesticide residue analysis. You call your Department of Ag, like the woman up here was saying earlier. You call your Department of Ag, they come do a sample, they send it to a lab, they do residue testing, and in this case it came back fipronil. Fipronil is a systemic insecticide. It is not one of the neonicotinoid. It's not in that class. It's commonly used around the foundations of homes for ants, termites, which we don't have in Minnesota, maybe yellow jackets. It was an application done in the city in September. So maybe it was yellow jackets, but it was sprayed enough. It got onto flowers where 3 bee colonies within a mile of each other were killed. We've never found the person who did it. No one would, of course, own up. But this lady was furious. And she just marched into the Minnesota Capitol building and said, this will not happen again. And she's a very wealthy woman. So maybe what you need to get your policy started is to kill a colony of bees on some of these properties that have a lot of money and influence. It worked. And she went back to our legislature, and they passed a bill saying that if it was an acute pesticide poisoning, and they could determine that through residue testing of the bees, then the beekeeper's entitled to fair market value of those bees and colonies, not to exceed $20,000 a year. And the Department of Ag, Minnesota Department of Ag, would compensate unless the pesticide applicator was against the label. And then the pesticide applicator must pay. So if they could identify who applied it and it was against the label, they would pay. If they could identify who applied it, but it was according to label and it still killed the bees, then the Department of Ag would have to pay. Okay.
Okay, well, excuse me, on that last one, the person spraying that doesn't have to pay, is that correct?
I'm sorry, the beekeeper does not pay. The beekeeper gets paid.
The beekeeper gets paid, but the actual person spraying, in other words, if I'm in that store and you're not spraying in accordance to the label, I'm not adding money, is that correct?
Wait, I'm not quite understanding. If you sprayed and it was with the label, you were according to label, it was a legal application, but it killed the bees,
Right.
the Department of Ag would pay the beekeeper.
But it's just that there's no penalty for the person using the poison.
But if you can't find the person that did it, like in this case we couldn't, there has to be a way to compensate the beekeeper. So the Department of Ag will do that. In part, all of this policy began with these ladies. There's only one of them shown right here. This is Christy Allen, and she and another business partner, Aaron Rupp, started this business called the Bee's Knees, with Z's. And it began with Christy pedaling her bicycle around town selling honey out of that wooden trailer in the back. Winter and summer, she's riding around town dressed as a bee. You can see the little antennae on her helmet, yellow and white, black bicycle. She does the whole 9 yards. And she and her business partner started a community honey extracting facility where they invented these bicycle-powered honey extractors. So they took the pedals and then they rigged it so the extractor. So you're sitting there basically on what do they call those things in the gym? Spinning class. Very easy to extract the honey, much easier than a hand extractor. So they started a community extracting facility, and then during the winter and during our legislative session, they use it as kind of a community advocacy place. And they all banded together, started this Healthy Bees, Healthy Lives, and they were the ones who marched on the Capitol in their bee suits and their bicycles and who knows what, and really got a lot of legislation and awareness. Okay. The state of Minnesota is kind of amazing because they have a trust fund that comes from lottery money. So a lot of the lottery money goes into this Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And anybody can apply for a grant to this trust fund for money for it. And it has to have something to do with natural resources and in particular native bees or native species of plants or native prairies. You can do land acquisition, you can do educational programming, but I asked for a professor and they funded it. So I'm kind of on a roll right now. And of course, you know, we were talking about the presidential initiative. A lot of that came, again, maybe not from the president, but the president's wife, because this is Michelle Obama's colony on the South Lawn next to her organic garden and her pollinator garden. And they're a beekeeper. They have a beekeeper who harvests this honey. The reason it's up on a stand like this, do you know the story behind this? So they got their bees before their dog. Remember all the stuff when Obama moved in and he was going to get a dog and he didn't know what kind of dog, and on, what kind of dog. Well, the bees were there and they decided they better elevate the bees so whatever kind of dog they got, you know, like one this, wouldn't get into the beehive. But then they had to strap it down because that's where the helicopter lands. So it's kind of difficult to work a hive of bees on a ladder, but they do it. And from that, and all of the attention that everybody's been paying to bees and pollinators in general and monarchs and everything happening at once, they created a task force. This is the Presidential Pollinator Initiative. They were given 180 days, and they were all of these agencies, the Secretary of Ag, the EPA, Departments of State, Defense, Interior, HED, Transportation, Energy, etc., all had to come up with ways that they were going to protect pollinators on their properties. Department of Defense has a lot of property, okay? And what are they going to do? So these, again, were best management practices, plans, pollinator plans. How are you going to do this thing? There was no money to implement, but how would you do this? And so, for example, there's a woman in Minneapolis who's in charge of the National Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association, and she's in charge of putting together best management practices for corporations, their landscaping. I mean, imagine McDonald's and Walmart and Target and Home Depot and name a suburban strip mall thing, and those are the kinds of places that they're starting to redesign landscapes for, or trying to give them ideas of how they could make those kind of landscapes more pollinator friendly. So there's big things afoot, but there's not a lot of money behind it. There's a lot of talk behind it. Okay, so those are just some of the pollinator initiatives that are going on in Minnesota. Right now we're in session again, legislative session, and I think they're pushing for more attention being paid to our roadsides in Minnesota that are sprayed, and not only mowed, but they're sprayed. So we're really pushing for our Department of Transportation, for the legislator, if they would put more money into the Department of Transportation to improve our roadsides. Okay, so this is our Bee Lab website, and I put this up here because, do you recognize this person? That's Megan. And she worked for me years ago. Oh good, do I need to tell a Megan story? I understand I'm being taped and I'm being filmed, so Megan, this is for you. She took a social insects class and did very well in it, but it's part theory. And she kept saying, I'm really not into theory. I just want practical stuff. I just want to know how to and how to make it better for bees. I don't want to do your theory stuff. And I kept giving her questions. On the final exam, she just totally did not answer the theory questions. And she put her foot down and said, I just won't answer them. I'm not interested in that. I'm not answering that. I said, you're going to flunk this class. Put down something. And we went back and forth, and I won't. She didn't flunk it. But I really appreciated her, how spunky she was, and how in love with bees she already was. I forget what year this was. So I hired her to work for me that summer. Don't ask her any theory questions. She's a great person. She's a great beekeeper. She's doing work with commercial beekeepers right now. I'll talk a little bit about that. And they really, really like her. Okay. In fact, this is what she's doing. So one of the things I noticed after breeding bees for so many years was that beekeepers, the commercial beekeepers, were not selecting for the traits that, like this hygienic trait that I've been working on for so many years, and I couldn't figure out why they wouldn't select for hygienic behavior. It's so easy to do. So I went out to California to the major bee breeders out there and just spent some time with them. And at first they were really suspicious. What are you doing out of the ivory tower? Why are you here? What are you going to do? And I said, I'm just here to learn. I want to understand if you can select for this trait, what can I do to help you select for this trait? And after 3 years of visiting them and going back and forth and really getting to know them, I realized that they just needed help doing it. Their schedules are so full. Queen rearing season in Northern California and other places is just so intense that doing more selecting and especially record keeping is particularly hard for them. So I said, what if we got together a team of people that could come out and do this for you? They would not be regulatory. They would just help you sample your bees. You could look at levels of nosema, levels of varroa, levels of virus. We could do pesticide analysis for you. We can help you select for hygienic behavior and any other research needs that you can have. And they said, bring it on. So we got grant money, and now it's through the Bee Informed Partnership, and we've created these tech transfer teams. And they're really taking off. So Megan's working on that right now with Katie Lee. I don't think Megan's in that photo. Katie's working up in the upper Midwest tech transfer team. So we have people in Northern California that work with the bee breeders. We have people up in Minnesota, North Dakota, who track migratory beekeepers as they go over to Almonds or down to Texas to raise queens. We have a tech team that goes from Florida, Georgia, over to Southern California and follows those migratory beekeepers. We started one in Oregon for all of the people in Oregon that do a lot of crop and seed pollination, vegetable pollination. And we'll be starting one in Texas next. And I think Megan might be on that one, I'm not sure. So this is just a way to help the commercial beekeepers get a hold of what's going on in their colonies and to help them do some bee breeding, more bee breeding. At the same time, there's been a huge surge, as you know, in backyard beekeeping. Everybody wants to be a backyard beekeeper. And so I decided that I would start an urban beekeeping program through the University of Minnesota, through my lab. And it's actually a business that we run through the lab, and we call it the Bee Squad. And fortunately, I was able to hire Becky, who was my very first PhD student, who decided she didn't want anything to do with academia. Maybe it's me, it was Megan. She didn't want anything to do with academia. She went and sold real estate and retired at the age of 40. She did well. And then her husband, I ran into him a couple years ago, and he said, "Do you have anything for Becky to do? I need to get her out of the house. She's too really high energy. She's very creative." And I said, "Yeah, actually, I do. She doesn't have to do the bees if she doesn't want to. She just run this bee squad, but now she's the main beekeeper." So she's taken this to a place that's way beyond my wildest dreams. We originally started it because of all the increasing concern for bees and the popularity of beekeeping. We thought it would be a good way to help new beekeepers. We do not have a state apiary program. We don't have registration in Minnesota. There's no way we can regulate AFB in the state or anything that anybody's doing in their bee colonies. So I thought we need at least some kind of educational program. So we started mentoring first. I really wanted it to be like the Geek Squad, where you're a beekeeper, you call us up, we get in a little cute vehicle that, and drive out and help you. But the business model on that was way too expensive. Twin Cities is a huge metro area. We couldn't do it. So instead, we started apiaries on campus where people come in on a Saturday, pay a slight fee, you get mentoring, you can sign up for 2 to 3 sessions or however many you need to get some hands-on training in a small group of 5 or 6 people. We do some, if you do have a problem, we can go out and help. We do wild bee education. We have some wild bee safaris where people come in, and some of my graduate students take people out looking at our native bees, the flowers that they're on, and how to photograph native bees on the flowers, and some information on gardening, much like Loretta was doing. Here's some people that are on the team, part-time helpers. But this is the program that really took off, that I had no idea. So homeowners in the Twin Cities area, some of them said, "Yeah, we want bees, but we don't want to be the beekeeper. Can you be our beekeeper?" And we said, "Okay, but we need to price this at a price where we can do this." And they said, "Fine." So we charge $1,000 for the season. But people buy their own bees, they buy their own equipment, they get their permit. We can help them do all of this stuff, but they pay us to be the beekeeper. And they're wealthy clientele, but they become very, very engaged, and they become donors to the bee lab and donors for a cause. They fall in love with their bees. And then businesses started catching on. Aveda, our art museums at the university, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, General Mills headquarters is there, Target headquarters is there, Hirschfield's Paint, Intelligent Nutrients, which is Horst Reckenbacher's place, golf clubs, and I'll tell you a story about golf clubs. All of us, they said, "We want a beehive on our property or on our roof. We'll pay you to do this thing." And then they start asking questions like, "So what are these bees going to eat? What can we plant on our backyard or our corporate headquarters for your bees?" And you say, "Well, actually your bees are flying 8,000 acres around from where you are, but you can help by doing, planting these things." Town and Country Golf Club is a country club. It's a very high-end country club, and they wanted bees on their roof. So we said, okay, we can do this thing. And then the next day, we put bees on the roof. And then the next day they said, and by the way, tomorrow we're going to inject 80 of our flowering linden trees with imidacloprid, because our country club golfers don't like the holes in the trees that the Japanese beetles chew. And we said, if you do that, you may kill your colony, if that's okay with you, you know. So we showed them. They didn't kill their colony, but their colony really went backwards for several months, and then didn't make it through winter. It couldn't rebound enough to get enough honey for the winter. And then they saw the light, and the next year they started telling all their country club members, sorry, we're going to have holes in all of our linden trees. We're not using any of these pesticides. We're planting flowers in our roughs. We're changing all of our landscape practices. And they write in their national golf magazine about their bees and how proud they are of their bee colony now that's living. So just having a beehive in some strategic places, I didn't want a high-end service. I wanted to help everybody. I didn't want income inequality from the University of Minnesota. But it turns out that when you put beehives on some of these corporate headquarters and some of these wealthy people's houses, their backyards, it helps. It helps a lot for awareness. So here's some of our colonies on a museum roof and the University of Minnesota museum's roof. And of course, when you go to an art museum, they have to paint the hives. And we collect data from them. So we know where all our package bees come from when they come to Minnesota, and these people buy their package bees from particular suppliers. I know the queen producer that's producing them in California. So I can collect all kinds of data on how those producers' queens are performing in the Twin Cities. We can enter all of the data into the national database through the Bee Informed Partnership. I can do this all anonymously and give feedback to the beekeeper, the queen producer in California anonymously. So it benefits, it goes back around and benefits the queen producers too. This was just about our wild bee safari I talked about. So all of this is, of course, to protect pollinators, and I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. I thought I would give you a talk that I've been giving to the public lately. It's about something I've been thinking a lot about. This woman, Laura Corcoran, I don't know who she is, but she sends me her drawings on occasion, and I think they're just amazing. They really, we grow corn and soybeans in Minnesota. That's what we're about. And so she draws these photos of how we're going to protect our pollinators and grow corn and soybeans at the same time. But I read this is where I want to go. I read this book. This is Ruth De Fries, and she's actually a MacArthur Fellow also. And she wrote this book called The Big Ratchet. And in this book, her thesis is that throughout evolutionary time, and then throughout human time, what we tend to do, what nature tends to do, and what humans tend to do is ratchet something up. So for example, as life began on Earth, there was all this speciation, many species evolved and developed, and then there's an extinction event, and that would be a hatchet. So there's a ratchet, there's a hatchet, then there's a pivot. So an extinction event of dinosaurs, for example, is a hatchet. And in human development, there's been ratcheting and hatcheting and then pivoting. And after I read her book, and she talks a lot about the Green Revolution too, I decided to put together this talk to put her thesis in the pollinator framework, or put pollinators in her framework. So, do you know about the Green Revolution? It's interesting, the Green Revolution was started by a guy named Norman Borlaug, who actually came from the University of Minnesota. And he was in Borlaug Hall, which is named after him, which is next to the entomology building. So he's not alive right now, but he was the creator and founder of the Green Revolution. And his idea was he was a plant breeder, and he wanted to develop varieties of wheat and rice to feed underdeveloped nations. So he developed varieties of wheat and took them to Mexico, and he planted them very intensely. He began very intensive farming, and wheat production in Mexico went sky high and fed people in Mexico, and he did the same for rice in India. His intentions were very good. He wanted to feed the world, and he wanted to do it on small plots of land intensively. But what happens when you have a really good idea? There's a ratchet. And this is what's come from that, is that we are now growing intensively and on huge scales, but not necessarily feeding people. In corn, it's feeding cars, ethanol, or it's feeding livestock, so indirectly it's feeding people. So this is an example of a good idea gone ratchet, if you will. There's been a huge ratchet in how we landscape our cities. And another form of a monocrop or a single species grown would be our grass lawns. And I blocked out the home because I show this a lot in Minnesota, and I didn't want to be insulting to anybody. But another ratchet is how we grow almonds. Okay, we're the world's largest producers and exporters of almonds, but 800,000 acres of almonds is a ratchet in how that is grown. And that, because of that, we've had to ratchet how we do our beekeeping. Commercial beekeepers would prefer not to be doing this, but in order to pollinate that crop, in order to make a living, they've had to ratchet up how they've done their commercial beekeeping. And that means they've had to also ratchet up how much they have to bulk up their bees in order to get them strong enough to get paid by the almond grower to pollinate that crop. So almonds grow at the end of February, and in order for a bee colony, the almond growers demand that a colony of bees have at least 8 to 10 frames of bees in it. And in order to get them like that, especially if the colonies are coming from Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, you've got to feed them to bulk them up in order to get them to that strength by the end of February. So I don't know that the bees need to be that strong to pollinate the almonds. It used to be a long time ago that beekeepers took their bees into almonds just so to let them grow. But now they have to be grown before the almonds. It's disturbing. There's been a big ratchet in insecticide use and the development of many kinds of different insecticides. I'll just leave it at that for right now. I can answer questions about particular ones. But right now, I think we all need to be paying attention to not just the insecticides, but the herbicides. Because of it's not the genetically modified crops that are a problem for bees, it's that they allow us to use a lot of herbicide, and we are using herbicide everywhere, wall to wall. Herbicides are killing off all the flowering weedy plants that our bees need for survival. And this pertains mostly into the breadbasket states, the upper Midwest, the corn and soybean states. Okay, so when you have big ratchets like that, and we are at a big ratchet, I would say we are finally at the hatchet stage. The public has caught awareness of this, but I would say actually that the hatchet for honeybees happened way before all of this. And the hatchet for honeybees started at World War II when we started to when we changed our agricultural practices. A big hatchet came in the 80s, early 90s when varroa was introduced in the United States. That was a hatchet for bees. Of course, you all know varroa is a big problem. Varroa and its viruses, well, it's not its viruses. The viruses are bee viruses. This is important for you to understand. Bees have had these viruses for a very long time, but they were latent, not a problem. You've got virus in you too, that's not a problem. But when the varroa mite starts feeding on the bee like a dirty syringe, it picks up some of the virus activates and replicates within the mite, and then as the mite goes from bee to bee feeding, it's like a dirty syringe injecting some of the virus particles into other bees, and pretty soon you have a virus problem. So varroa and viruses now are a big problem. Beekeepers originally, when varroa was introduced, started using these synthetic miticides, the Apistan first, then Coumaphos, and of course the mites said, bring it on, we can deal with this. Any insecticide that has a single activation or a single point mode of action is relatively easy for any organism to do an end run around. Their physiology can come up with another way to get around that particular neurotransmitter not working, for example. So the mites develop resistance to these compounds. They don't work anymore. So we had the mites, but in the mites since the late 80s and early 90s. But when colony collapse disorder came on the scene in 2006, 2007, it was clear it was just something more than varroa. A lot of people said it was just varroa, but it was clear there was something else going on in addition to varroa mites. And I think most everybody agrees that the problem with honeybees right now is everything under the sun, just about, and combining in horrible ways. So we know that there's mites, we know that mites, and we know there's nosema, we know that there's viruses, we know that combination of mite plus virus is really lethal. We know that there's pesticides out in the environment, but we know that beekeepers were also applying pesticides within the colony that were leaving residue in wax combs, and sometimes some environmental pesticides combine really poorly with in-hive miticides in this cocktail effect that can be extremely more lethal, a synergetic effect that can be more lethal than each of them alone. We know that there's monocrops and the agricultural practices that go around it, and in many cases a flowerless landscape. And so Zach Browning is a commercial beekeeper from North Dakota, and I think he put it the best. He said, you know, our honeybees, our wild bees, and all of our other pollinators are reduced to feeding on scraps. And I would say in Minnesota, and it's becoming more and more true for North Dakota, this is the truth. As they start increasing the acreage of corn and soybeans and stop putting their land and set aside land as CRP, our bees, they're just feeding on little places here and there for their food. Nesting sites for our wild bees, even if they're in the ground or if they're stem nesters, have been paved, plowed, or chopped down. So our native bees, in addition to having flowerless landscape problems in many areas and pesticide issues, just that they're just where they need to nest is in scarcity. So it's great to put up those kind of wild bee nests. So I think all of this is to say, I think what we're experiencing right now with all this public awareness is a hatchet on the green revolution itself. And it's not that Norman Borlaug was a bad guy or that what he thought was wrong. He was actually trying to feed the world. It's just that where we took it after where he left off. So I think what's happening right now is that we're really rethinking how we're doing our agricultural landscapes, our urban landscapes, our suburban landscapes, and how can we do what's called reconciliation ecology, which is instead of preserving land separate from human disturbed landscapes, it's putting natural areas within human landscapes so that we can have more diversity. Okay, so when there's a hatchet, and I would say we're at one right now, which is probably a good thing, then Ruth De Fries in her book argues that there's a pivot. And when it involves humans, there's a lot of ingenuity and creativity that happens at the pivot time. So this is a good thing. If we're at a pivot point, let's not complain. Let's rock. Let's do this thing. Let's be creative. So the pivot already happened. The public's all on top of the public they're aware of the pollinator plight. The president's aware of it. There's a presidential initiative. There's states that are like Minnesota that have all kinds of policy changes. You see Whole Foods advertising like this, Time Magazine, National Geographic's coming out with something. I mean, everybody's on top of it. With the die-off of honeybees, there's been a huge increase in awareness about all of our native bees. No one really thought about native bees before. Now we understand we need both honeybees and native bees, and when you have them together in the same crop, they really are better at pollination together than they are separately. So we need all of them. I think the biggest pivot that's happening right now is going right along with the local food movement. So people are really interested now in food labeling and nutrition. Everybody wants to know what's in their food. Everybody's reading the labels. You want to know if it's organic, if it's gluten-free. You want to know if it's got pesticide. You want to know everything about your food. And I would say we want good, clean food, and so do our bees. And you know, I think if we could speak for bees, we would say that they would like a little bit of food labeling on their food. I mean, they can tell from their antennae and their tongues very well about the quality of the pollen and the nectar. They can sense the odors and the protein and lipid content. They're very good at food quality. But I think they would like to know which plants are actually are toxic to them, have toxicity because of a pesticide application. I think another pivot that's happening in the beekeeping industry, it's a big one, is that beekeepers are starting to understand that all of the artificial feeds, the pollen substitute, the sugar syrup, the corn syrup, are not good substitutes for nectar and pollen. And I was very, very pleased to see a researcher from the USDA lab in Tucson, Arizona. They were the ones that developed Megabee, and Dr. Gloria DeGrande Hoffman at the recent entomology meetings said actually all of those pollen substitutes like Megabee that are made of soybean powder and brewer's yeast, they're pretty much like junk food for bees. And we really need to be developing diets for bees that are based on stuff that they actually eat, like pollen. And so somebody in the audience asked her, so if that's true for pollen, what about feeding corn syrup? And her response was, well, yeah, it's kind of like feeding a bee, eating an Oreo and washing it down with Coca-Cola. Yeah. So I think this is a good thing, this pivot right now of researchers understanding that bees really need better nutrition and they need more natural nutrition is a great pivot. And I think that all of the research, without going into the research itself, keeps coming down to this basic thing, that bees really need good nutrition. And what we know is when bees have good protein, they can detoxify some of the pesticides. Protein makes enzymes that can detoxify pesticides. When bees have good nutrition, then they can fight off some of the diseases. It's just like us, right? Think of you and good nutrition and what it allows you to do physiologically and health-wise. So a lot of the things for bees is just getting getting a handle on getting them much better nutrition. And the best nutrition is simply good flowers and lots of them. That won't help us with our varroa mite problem. So we really need the big pivot that needs to happen now, and I'm starting to see it in the research community. For many years, there seemed to be no more research on varroa. And now I'm starting to see lots of people say, okay, how can we control varroa without chemicals? So stay tuned on this. It's brewing. It's bubbling in the research community, coming up with alternative ways to control varroa. And I would say don't forget the bees themselves, because they are very good at defending themselves. They have a great healthcare system. We call it social immunity in the research language, where behaviors of the bees within the colony can help ward off other diseases and problems. Hygienic behavior is a form of social immunity, where individual bees are acting like cells in an immune system, where they are going to detect disease. They can detect a foreign invader in the colony or a foreign microbe and remove it from the colony. And propolis collection, we're finding that colonies that make a propolis envelope within the hive, in other words, line their walls of the nest with propolis, and they'll do this if they have a rough surface inside the colony. colonies that have a propolis envelope, it really helps them with their diseases and it helps their immune systems. Propolis is a good thing. We've all hated propolis because it makes it working the bees hard. It turns out if we would allow the bees to put it where they do naturally, and I'll talk a lot about the research tomorrow, I'll show you the research, it really would help them. Another thing we're going to have to figure out is how we're going to have pesticides and pollinators. And I'm all for, although I can't really do it from my position in the university, being an advocate in some of the pesticide work and the Pesticide Action Network, I can't get involved with that through the university. But I really think it's not a matter of banning particular pesticides, because when you ban a pesticide, either you get sued by the chemical company, or they're going to develop another insecticide that's worse. So what I'd rather do is use this awareness about our pollinators to come up with ways to go, okay, we recognize that on certain crops at certain times you're going to have to use pesticides to control your crops. How can you do this in a way that wouldn't harm pollinators? How can we have both? So some of these pivots that people are coming up with, there's a huge project in Iowa now, it's called the STRIPS project. They've done all kinds of research where they put in strips of native plants in marginal land, so in other words, land that doesn't yield very much corn because it's poor soil or it's whatever, if it's just not on good land for corn production, if they plant it in these flowering prairie swaths or strips, that it actually brings in insects that kill off the pests in the corn. It actually increases the yield of the corn. It prevents soil erosion. It keeps the nitrogen in the soil. It increases water quality. It has these enormous benefits, just these strips, buffer strips. Another one in Minnesota, at least, they're realizing that when they restore prairies, that they need to put in a lot more flowering plants. Because the flowering plants also, it's not just our pollinators that bring in the game birds. And then Pheasants Forever got on board and they said, yeah, actually, if you start putting in flowers, we're going to get more quail and more pheasants. So now they have a big Pollinator Forever program. When Pheasants Forever goes to Washington, D.C. and starts lobbying for pollinators through hunting groups, this is now we're getting places. The cover crops thing, people are starting to really understand, yeah, and there's money to be had in putting your land through NRCS, putting your land into cover crops, because these fix nitrogen in the soil and really remediate soil in a great way and provide food for bees, food for soil, food for bees. Roadsides in Minnesota is where I'd really like to put a lot of effort. Our Department of Transportation does have some roadsides that look like this. This is Minnesota. Our Department of Transportation, Tina Markelson, did send me these photos. Here's one all full of Asclepias, which is milkweed for our monarchs. This is I-94 that runs right through the Twin Cities, not far from Minneapolis, not far from St. Paul campus, I mean. So we do have areas where there are a lot of native plants that are growing, but we need more of them. I have a student that's studying bee lawns. So first of all, it's what kind of turf can we put in. If you have to grow a lawn and you really want to mow it, what kind of lawn could we put in that wouldn't require so much water, that wouldn't require so much mowing? And that is hard fescue, at least for Minnesota, not in this area necessarily. And then what flowers can we put into that hard fescue that would continue to flower that you could mow after mowing? Okay, so we know Dutch clover, not sweet clover, Dutch clover continues to flower after mowing. But what other flowers can we put in there that won't be so invasive, like dandelions and creeping Charlie and those kinds that we know do really well in a lawn? They prefer to be the lawn, actually. What other flowers can we put in there so that you could maintain a manicured lawn and still have it flower? So I just bring this back up in case you're interested in the book, The Big Ratchet. So we are at a pivot point. It's a good one. Everything that's going on now in beekeeping organizations throughout the nation are all trying to, I'm hearing beekeepers talk about native bees, which is great. I'm hearing beekeepers talk about habitat. I mean, how can we have a campaign for every bee colony that's out there where there's an acre planted somewhere? You know, 1 bee colony, 1 acre, something like that. This is the pivot, this is the time for all of you to use your ingenuity, and it's a great time. So this is the message. Plant a bunch of bee-friendly flowers out there, and it's all you have to do is avoid pesticide contamination of those flowers that you plant. You don't have to say avoid all pesticides. Just plant flowers for bees and don't contaminate those flowers. And I think that's the way forward, so that you have these refuges. You can say these are pollinator plantings. Okay, this is, you know, plants for bees, coming up with plant lists. This is one that we developed. It's on our website. It's only good for Minnesota, really. You don't want to plant them here. But things that you can do is put out these plant lists for people. And I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Very invigorating talk. Thank you, Dr. Spivak. Questions? She'll take some questions if you have time in the back. Christine?
Has anybody ever noticed bees selecting a flower knowing that there's a pesticide on it, like avoiding that flower?
Yeah, there are some pyrethroids that are actually repellents. If you get them high enough dose on the concentration on the plant, they are a repellent to bees. They won't go. So one idea, I mean, for the chemical companies is for some of these insecticides to add a repellent in there. But then the bees would go, if they needed to pollinate, they wouldn't go. So. But mostly, no, they can't tell. And then actually there's pollens that are toxic to bees. The South Carolina state flower, jessamine is the common name, is actually very toxic to bees. And honeybees go out and collect it and then eat it later, and it's very toxic to them. So they have a hard time with toxicity.
So are any of the pesticide people working on like natural, more organic things? I mean, I've heard like vinegar kill things.
Certainly the organic farming industry has a whole, that's what they do. But, not big ag. They're more into the technological solutions, synthetic insecticides.
Melanie, do you have a question?
I did. Marla, I'm so glad you're here. And this is just more to kind of, not so much a direct, I'm not looking for a direct answer, because I don't know if there really is one, but I'm just looking to see what your thoughts on it are. So talking about habitat and nutrition needed, and then now going back to these California breeders or large-scale breeders of queen producers, knowing that some of them are rearing their queens and producing their bees in habitat that really is rather compromised. What are your thoughts on that then in terms of how that relates to the mass exodus and that sort of spreading around? I mean, here in New Mexico, we see bees coming in, and I'm at a point where it's, I want to say, okay, let's shut the borders, but then on the other hand, it's like, we don't have enough supply. There's major demand. People want to help, but are we helping by bringing in compromised stock? And or what can we do to try and, well, what's your thoughts on that? It's a loaded sort of thought.
Yeah, you had about 5 thoughts in there.
Yeah.
That's okay. I thought about them. So the habitat one, I'll just do that. And then I'll share with you some ideas I've been thinking of, okay? There are queen producers that are putting in habitat around more and more flowering plants around Hikins, for example. If you go on there, if you go to where their queen ring location, Russell has put in a lot of flowering plants and others. So I think they can plant habitat in their area. But what I've been wondering about and thinking a lot about is whether it's people like you, Melanie, and others in Vermont and others all over that are doing the local bee breeding. And I think that's excellent, and there's a lot of benefit on that to that. And I would like to get back into bee breeding again to work with you and others on that a little bit more. But I'm wondering if in the industry there there could be or there should be more of a split. So I'm wondering if the commercial guys that do the pollination contracts, that move their bees all over, if the genetics of their bees should be just for that. And the rest of the beekeepers should be getting from more local suppliers. It would mean that the package bee industry would have to change or stop. We could not continue to bring in package bees from the big suppliers because those would have to go stay within the commercial industry. So, in other words, it's the genetics of the bees we could diversify among the backyard and local and regional beekeepers and keep it separate from the commercial guys. At the same time, the commercial guys, there are really good livestock management techniques that could be used. For example, when I talk to people in our veterinary school about the bee problem, and I say things like, yeah, the bees go to California, and it's oh my God, there's all these 1.8 million colonies or whatever that are there right now sharing diseases. And the people from the vet school say, wow, we figured out how to do this in cattle and sheep and pigs years ago. If they're all in one location, they must be treated all together at the same time. If the commercial beekeeping industry was regulated by FDA, which I do not recommend, so don't say that I went there. But if they were, they would have to be treated before they left California. But the fact is that it would be a good management practice to not spread the diseases and the mites throughout the rest of the country as they migrate. It's that pesticides and pollinators. We do need commercial pollination of our crops. That's not going to stop. But how do we do this in a way that we can also have more local stocks that are not threatened by that, or that we can have good genetics for migratory beekeepers and good genetics for the local stock? And those are things that I've been thinking about, maybe writing big grants about in the future. Does that answer the question?
It does. I mean, because my thoughts are more as to how exactly that. What's that reconciliation? I mean, we have the demand, but we don't have the supply. Who is any one person, farmer, institution, organization to say, okay, nobody else can do this? But then again, are the people who are really wanting to do it, if they're educated and knowing, or what are the reasons for wanting to do these? Is it because it's hip and it's trendy, or is it because they actually want to help the bees? Then how helpful is it to bring in compromised power? So just trying to figure out what that reconciliation is. Thank you. That was the question.
I'm really sorry to have to stop this. I listened for a couple more hours. Let's give Dr. Spivak a